I need to make a costume in 3 months. In Oathbringer, we get the biggest description of the undergarments that Shallan wears. She has a shift and a bodice vest. And there's never any mention of a corset or the big heavy petticoats that Vin was wearing in Mistborn. However, that's not to say that there wouldn't have been any sort of structural support garment, because the female body being what it is, you need support. And historically, in our world, that was done with either a corset or stays, and I'm guessing that the bodice vest serves that function. The havah is a one-piece garment, and it is described as being almost militaristic, and you really want a lot of structure for that, and if you're not doing that in the dress itself, you're doing that in the undergarments. Whalebone is not actually bone, it is the baleen, and a material on Roshar that would be very similar to that would be chitin. Obligatory mini rant. This word is pronounced chitin, and I know that because I have a $50,000 piece of paper that says I got a degree in entomology. And I'm talking to a camera by myself in my free time. Again, there's really no mention of the big heavy style petticoats that Vin was wearing in Mistborn, and the dress itself is referred to as being sleek, so I don't think that the skirt of a havah would be much bigger than a half circle skirt. There is probably some sort of a structural lower body garment going on, whether it's an underskirt that we do know are used in some havahs. It's just not going to be the same level of poof that Vin's courtly ball gowns are. And you really wouldn't want all of that anyway, because all of those layers that are going to drag on the ground just mean that they would wear out faster. If there's no boning in the support garment or in the dress itself, you're not going to get that militaristic yet feminine look from the havah. This is the one that I made for the firefight signing back in 2015. Here's the picture Brando Sando himself took of me and posted on the page for the firefight signing. It's still out there. I looked it up to make this video. And yes, I look like a complete dork in this picture. Because that's what happens when you're smiling ear to ear because your favorite author greeted you with Ms. Devar, I presume, and then proceeded to sign your book with great costume and asked if he could take a picture of my cosplay, and it was the greatest moment of my 24 years of life at that point. And you can see what I mean about foundations. I am wearing modern undergarments, and this havah does not sit as nicely as I know it could. Something else I will point out that other people who did havahs going to that signing, we didn't have the in-world drawings that we later got in Oathbringer and Rhythm of War, and so we all did this sort of tight safe hand sleeve, where in a lot of the images that we have now, it's a much more grandiose sleeve that kind of drills down and drapes off of the bottom of the hand. Also, Sanderson asked me how I managed to do the safe pouch, and I didn't have an answer because I was running out of time on that cosplay. And that has haunted me for the last 9 years. So that is something that I'm going to fix in this iteration of my havah. I started with this simplicity pattern and modified it to have a high collar, which I definitely need to fix in the new version because this just kind of sits like a wide boat neck collar. I want it to be more of like a mandarin collar. And I want to make this new version of a havah for 2 reasons. I kind of want to destroy this one that I already have and make the Shallan coming out of the chasms in Words of Radiance outfit. And 2, it's the year Stormlight 5 is coming out. The Dragonsteel Ball is Shallan and Adolin's wedding, and if I can't go to that, I'm at least going to have the Brightlady's outfit that I would have worn. One of the very important things to do when you are making a costume or a garment that you haven't made before is to make a mock-up. And My boyfriend laughed a little bit when he saw me doing the fitting of it, because this kind of looks like a walking advertisement for Google. What I did with this... No, I'm not gonna do it, because there's pins. There's pins in it. There's pins. I had to adjust the bust down even further, because I always underestimate how much I have to take the bust in on things. I think I'm just wishful thinking with the size of garments. And then, in addition to having to take in the bust, I had to trim the collar in the back because I made that a little bit too high. So I trimmed that down. I'm going to cut this all apart. Remember that it's a net pattern and I have to add seam allowances when I'm making my new pattern pieces, because that would be bad. And this line of pins that I have right here is where the angle of that front panel is going to be. As far as the bodice vest, what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to use the modified version of a corset cover that I've been working on, because I've made myself a couple of pairs of combinations from a truly Victorian pattern. And I also was trying to see if I could take you can see the seams better if I show you the wrong side, corset pattern and modify that, and see if I could do that for the bodice vest and do some sort of strap situation. I don't want to spend the time messing with the fitting of that for the timeline that I have. So my initial thought was to use a corset I already had. However, because of the aforementioned taking the bust in issue, this had some gamping at the top that I just knew I wouldn't be able to fix with any amount of corset cover, so I had to think of something else. Ultimately, I decided to trim down the top of the corset and eliminate the overbust problem, but if I did that to this white corset, I wouldn't still have it if I wanted to do a Zatanna costume again, so I decided to cut up this blue one that I never wear instead. I marked the line where I wanted to cut it with tailor's chalk, and it worked out great. The top is still unfinished and a little uneven, but you had no idea when you saw me in the costume at the con, did you? Next came the tedious process of measuring, marking, and tracing the new seam allowance on every piece I modified to get the shape and fit that I wanted, and this took up a significant portion of the time spent making the mockup. I went ahead and trimmed the official pattern pieces so that I don't have to refit the bust ever again, and then I bought a roll of 16-inch wide tracing paper on Amazon and traced out all my new pattern pieces, including measuring and marking the new length of all the dress panels. Where you saw me pulling pieces to the side was figuring out the cutting layout and how much yardage I would ultimately have to buy to accommodate the costume. I traced all the pieces onto white cotton muslin with tailor's chalk, and then cut them out so I could do a full fitting of the mock-up with the undergarments and make any necessary fine-tuning of the proportions before cutting into the final fabric. I ended up not going with that sleeve shape because it made too much of a puff at the shoulder, so I found one of the sleeves I had taken off my Toriel costume a couple years ago because I wanted the sleeveless part for a Christmas overdress, and that smoothed everything out. I ordered various different sample fabric swatches to get an idea for fabric weight and transparency, and it's obvious this one is pretty see-through. I will keep it in mind for doubling up with a lining to make a Beaubaton uniform at some point, but this very thin gauzy China silk was not it. I also looked at some silk satin, and this one on the left is the color I always picture for Colin blue, and the blue that Shalon wears a lot. It has more weight to it, while still being very drapey, and not nearly as transparent as the China silk, which color matches excellently and could be used as a lining. This is the most expensive fabric I ordered a sample of, and even though I knew I wasn't going to use it for this application, I still wanted to look at it. It is a very heavy duchesse satin that I'm sure Adolin would love for making a fashionable jacket that has just enough of a nod to the Alethi military uniforms, while absolutely not being what the outfitters would stock. Not what I need for the dress, though, and especially not at $80 a yard. Next were a couple of silk taffetas that, in the characteristic way of taffeta, will hold folds very well with an almost papery quality to it. I considered this for a petticoat under the havah, but ultimately decided against it, again, due to cost. In the end, I went with none of these options, because while I'm in my 30s and I make adult money now, I don't make enough adult money that I felt like spending $400 on just the fabric for the havah itself, not counting any linings, closures, underskirts, or other structural garments. And I went with a viscose satin because it was half the price of my favorite silk option. I also picked green because I was not specifically trying to cosplay Shallan, and with my red hair, that's what everyone would have thought. I cut out all my pieces for the havah and the lining. The lining fabric I bought is also viscose, and while it is a straight weave instead of a satin, it was still slippery as all get out. I stitched along the center front to have a nice finished edge, turned and pressed it. Then I top-stitched along the edge to make sure it laid flat. I also added a layer of wool interlining at just the top of the front to give it a little added structure. And because I knew I was going to add hook and eye closures, I wanted to make sure that it wouldn't warp under the force of holding the dress shut. I simply lined up the front panel of the dress, cut out the wool, and then added basting stitches, these big zigzag stitches, so that they would effectively behave as one piece of fabric for the purposes of attaching the lining, and then I took them out when I was turning and pressing the front lining. The side fronts were a little more complicated because they are lined, but the lining is deliberately visible part of the way down. So what I had to do was mark where that division was going to happen, then stitch from there down to the hem, as if I was going to simply turn the lining to the inside, and then clip the seam allowance to the stitching line, and sew the side front to the front, and the side front lining to the front lining separately. Any raw edges remaining from turning the linings to the inside were resolved in either the side seams or the collar seam. Any seams that were not finished to the inside with a lining, I used pinking shears on to prevent raveling. The back was comparatively easy. I sewed up the center back seam, sewed the side back sections to the back sections, clipped the curves, and pressed the seams open so they would lie flat. Then I sewed the front to the back, at the shoulders and side seams. As a last bit of construction research, I went and found my legally distinct from Sansa Stark dress that I also made in 2015. And in looking at it, I discovered that the place the sleeve and the sleeve lining were top-stitched was at the very bottom, where it will be hidden out of sight when draping, while the forward-facing cuff edge is where the two pieces were attached together and turned. Furthermore, the sleeve lining was turned and stitched to the seam allowance between the upper and lower sleeve, and this is going to come in handy in just a moment. You run a supporting cord from nearby seam. So there is a seam in this sleeve with the cord running down, and I have buttons attached to that cord, and then the safety pouch buttons on it. I can do this without flashing everyone. Very responsible. When a Voran woman reaches a certain age, she starts to cover her safe hand. I thought that instead of having a different safe pouch for every garment, my character would still be using the safe pouch from when she wore her first havah. In my mind, her mother made it for her, and it's sentimental, and objects of a personal or sentimental nature are kept in a safe pouch. I began by pressing the fabric flat and then pulling out a thread of the weave to make a gap I could cut down and ensure that my pieces stayed perfectly square. Here you can see, sometimes sewing is very technical with a lot of precise calculation, and other times you use a Warbreaker coaster to sketch out the triangle for the flap of a pouch, and it's pure vibes and estimating the seam allowance. The rectangle underneath is the pouch itself, and once again, I just used some tailor's chalk to mark out the cutting lines. I was significantly less precise in keeping this floral viscose on grain, and I made use of a selvage edge on the pink fabric for the top of the flap, so I wouldn't have to worry about finishing that edge. Did I pin this incorrectly and have to redo it so the right sides were together for stitching? Yes. Yes, I did. I learned from that and did it right this time. For the front and the back, I stitched the pink cotton to the floral lining with right sides together, along both long sides and one short side, so there would be a finished edge along the top where it opens. I could hide the ugly seam inside the pouch itself, and then I could just top stitch the edges of the sides, since those seams were finished anyway. I cut buttonholes in the back of the pouch and finished them by hand so they could attach with buttons sewn into the sleeve. By this point, I had sewn the underarm seam of the lower sleeve and lower sleeve lining, and then sewed them together along the front edge as described earlier. I left the bottom open for the moment because I wanted to do all this and then fold the lower edges and top stitch them. This is where the seam will be that attaches the lower sleeve to the upper sleeve and the rest of the dress. I will be sewing this piece of twill tape inside the lining to support the weight of the safe pouch. Unfortunately, I apparently didn't do a very good job at sewing the buttons on because 2 of them came off in the half day between putting on my costume and describing to the panel attendees how I did it, and you can see me realize that live right here. After sorting out the safe pouch, I attached the sleeves, added some subtle shoulder pads to give a little bit more structure, then hung it up for a few days to allow any of the bias seams to stretch before leveling the hem and finishing with some bias tape. Somewhere along the way, and with absolutely no footage, I also made this underskirt. I recognize that this is a draw the rest of the owl moment, and I'm sorry for that. I made view B from this simplicity pattern right here.